University of Dundee, so they've got that great program up there. All right, so I'm just going to run through a few slides and then I'll read some stuff. So how did medicine become scientific? So in birth of, so if we, let's try that again, great. So is it skipping ahead? No, it's not, I'm sorry. So in Birth of the Clinic, Michel Foucault traces medicine's transition from like a material undertaking, so you take care of the sick person in front of you, and it's just about that sick person, to a series of conceptual practices. So it's like, oh, many people seem to be sick in the same way, right? And he talks about this kind of through the operation of what he calls the medical gaze. So I've got here a lovely vintage image of the eyeball and how it works, which is just very exciting. And then, so the medical gaze has two parts. It's empirical, so it's going to examine the human body and other things like bacteria as an object or a site of illness. But it's also linguistic, so it's a point at which the visible can be rendered into language. So this gaze doesn't really exist until you have the language to discuss the material that you're seeing. And this is a quote from Foucault, that the clinical gaze has the paradoxical ability to hear a language as soon as it perceives a spectacle. And I chose a wonderful image here of a plague doctor from the Middle Ages. And then I can't even actually remember what language that is. It's something from the Indian subcontinent someplace. But I just wanted to kind of combine those two elements. And therefore, I see Foucault's medical gaze as a site of articulation, and I have a vintage image here of a shoulder joint. But like articulation is kind of a way of fitting things together, but it's also a way of framing or pronouncing things. So, and we'll get to this later because there's some rhetorical work on articulation that's also important here. So the idea here that becomes important for medical humanities is, what's the cost of this? If we now have the scientific gaze that can produce something like this plague map, so this is a map of London, and they've highlighted the plague-ridden area in red, what gets lost in this translation? And by the 1970s, it's like, well, bedside manner has been lost, because the technical requirements of medicine are now such that we no longer can just have people who would like to take care of other people. They actually have to be really good at science and math. But the super talented scientists that we keep recruiting to medical schools maybe don't like taking care of sick people. So this creates a little bit of tension. So what are we going to do about this? So in the 1970s, they started instituting bioethics training. So they're like, okay, we're going to get these sciencey people and we're going to make them more human by teaching them about ethics and literature. And Kay Denner-Klauser, who's the first full-time medical humanities faculty member of all time, said that this type of training was lacking not just from medical education, but any type of vocational training. So engineers lack these kinds of awareness, auto mechanics, but in medicine it was a little bit more important to do this. He also said that you needed to have both sides, so the medical education, but also humanities people doing their work. And it's an interesting parallel because in the 19th century, they noted the same problems with surgeons. They felt that surgeons were very inhuman and just kind of treating the body as an object and not really kind of thinking about people. And that was because they only had vocational training. So they kind of popped them into humanities training in the 19th century, and apparently that fixed it until the 1970s when we had the same problem again. So ultimately, health humanities has humanistic study to make better doctors, and I found this super cute illustration. It's from a Russian children's book, but isn't it just darling? It's just very adorable. And then exploration of medicine as culture. This is a health humanities image of early public health interventions that led to the formation of the FDA. So as you can see, we have like cholera skeleton hanging out while children are drinking from a public fountain. So the humanities side is a little less cute often. So we kind of get into the grisly bits in a different way. So what are we doing about this? So narrative medicine, so have you guys heard of narrative medicine? Okay, so Rita Sharon, who is a physician at Columbia University, was feeling really burned out. She's an internist and a palliative care physician, and she's just like, this is hard. She's like, I always love to read. So she went over to the English department and started taking classes, and she wound up with a PhD, and she's like, this training teaches me so much about how to engage with patients and to be a better physician. So she started this narrative medicine. They started doing workshops, and then they offer master's degrees. So if you listen to her TEDx talk on this, she discusses narrative competence, and part of that is standing in the glare of illness, so sharing the patient's experience of anguish in the face of serious illness. She treats a lot of cancer patients. And Sanitana Dasgupta, who's a younger scholar, amended this, and she talks about narrative humility. So the idea that even though you think you're competent at this, you can never fully understand the experience of anybody else, but that doesn't mean to give up. You should still try anyway, as we saw earlier this afternoon. So I think she would very much applaud the efforts that we saw in this room. And then so Health Humanities broadens these perspectives. So Dasgupta and Sharon are both like Ivy League physicians. So we're broadening it from just physician perspectives to kind of capture everybody. And one of the things that we see in that trajectory is graphic medicine. So this is a screen grab off of the graphic medicine webpage. And so there's a definitive book from Penn State. So there's a Penn State collective, and it's a multidisciplinary collective of folks. And they're like, graphic medicine is a place where stories can be told in kind of comic book format. And they have a conference, there's a presence in the media and also journals. And medical journals also link up to this site. So I think the Lancet, for example, and JAMA have links to these. So it's taken quite seriously on both sides of the divide. So there's two issues that make me want to delve further. The first of which is that graphic medicine is almost entirely about patient memoir and patient experience and emotional experience, so it's very pathos-driven. The other is post-humanity. So at the same time that medicine was like, oh, we need to use the humanities to make better doctors, the humanities was like, oh, well, being a person isn't really just about being a human anymore. We need to account for technology and its dehumanizing influence. So humanities is now drifting away from exactly what medicine wants it to be doing. And I'm like, that's just fascinating. So I drew on Nathan Stormer. So he's a rhetorician of medicine. And he kind of drew on all this kind of post-human theory. So like Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and other work to say, okay, well, if we articulate things, those connections aren't necessarily predetermined. They're socially constructed, they're temporally constructed, and they're historically situated. So you need to understand all of those elements to really understand the relationships between the words and the things that you're putting together. So I think this bears both on what Foucault had to say about the medical gaze, but also on how we would receive things like graphic medicine, because those relationships between the words and the images and the experiences are also determined historically and personally in ways we may or may not fully get, which brings me back to narrative humility. So that's my kind of theoretical setup. And then I have two graphic narratives that I thought were absolutely fabulous. So the first is La Fabrique de Corps, which is kind of like the making of bodies or the fabrication of bodies. And it's the first prosthetics and human augmentation is the translation for the French title that you'll see there. And the other is the Wandering Uterus, and it's a Furor Uterinus and contemporary applications of ancient medical wisdom. So this is by Creata Wilbur, who's a medical illustrator, and she's the inaugural artist at the New York Academy of Medicine. So she's a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine based on her work. And then this woman is Heloise Chauchois, and she's I believe she's Belgian, and she does graphic illustration or medical illustration as well. But as you can see, she does work that's a little bit more oriented toward children. So why these two? Because they're by practicing medical illustrator, and medical illustration kind of bridges these two elements, so art and medicine, because they need to have an advanced medical or biological training in order to be qualified. And they're also showing evidence of attempts to kind of articulate practice and theory in their books. And here we have a close-up of the Wandering Uterus, just because I think he's really cute. Also, I just really liked the books. So I'm going to start with La Fabrique de Corps. And again, I think I'm just going to sort of speak to the slides and refer back to my talk rather than read. So are there any questions or comments thus far? No, we're good, okay. So for La Fabrique de Corps, again, it's by Héloïse Chauchois. So it tells the story of a young man who loses a limb, and he's visited by Ambrose Paré, who's the father of modern amputation, to learn about the history of amputation, phantom limbs, and prostheses. So this is kind of interesting. Paré is significant because as a 15th century battlefield doctor, he experimented on patients, like kind of without their consent, but they would have maybe all died anyway, we don't know. So it's kind of simultaneously, she's narrating things that are simultaneously extremely unethical, but also things that are kind of groundbreaking at the same time. So I'm like, there's an interesting tension there for me. So let me just situate this a little. So this is an image from Chauchois' work, and this is something called Promenade. So in the larger project that I'm doing, I situate her work in La Fabrique de Corps against other work that she does. So she normally does illustrations for children. So here she's illustrating how the horse's muscles work. And as you can see, she's got this kind of like very comics, child-friendly style. And this is from 2012. And then she does a lot of magazine illustrations for a book called Thinkovery. So that's also oriented toward children. And I think that's important when we're looking at the sort of the book that I'm thinking about, because her style is very accessible and cartoonish, but then when she brings it to bear on this more complicated subject matter, I think some interesting things happen. So this is an opening page here, so I'm gonna actually take a little look here. So the Delcourt website, so that's the publisher, describes this book as entertainingly and beautifully absurd. So it's this story that presents, and this is a loose translation of the French, without pathos or overt pedagogy, an intimate narrative and scientific adventure in a sublimely astonishing fictional fantasy. So this is what we're going to be getting. So we've got these very appealing kind of comic book style images. So she's presenting this individual experience of trauma, because the poor man has lost his arm there, and the history of prosthesis, and a vision for the future of humanity. So it's kind of a lot to cover in one graphic narrative for children. And she actually achieves these, I think. Her illustrations are absolutely beautiful, and they're also medically correct, and she kind of covers all the ground that she seems to set up. So we've got two entwined narrative threads, and I'm only showing images from one of those, but the first narrative thread is all in black and white. So immediately prior to this, there's a couple pages of this character, and he's going off someplace. He gets on his motorcycle, and he rides his motorcycle into a tree because he's trying to avoid hitting a deer, and he gets hit by a truck. So this is where he wakes up. And then there's another narrative here, so that is in color. So the first section of it is called Amputation, and again, I'm just kind of loosely translating the French. So that's in these colorways. Then we have Phantom Member, and I'll just show you quickly. That's in blue, so you can see that that's in a completely different colorway. And then the next section is Prostheses, and that's in green. And then she does a final section in this narrative, which you can see pulls all the colors together. And this section is called Transhumanism. So she's doing some really fascinating things visually with this particular book, in my humble opinion. Okay, so here we have our unnamed sufferer. So he wakes up, and we can see that Chauchois has situated him almost like he's a medical illustration. So we've got this little information here. So amputation, which I'll just translate loosely, is ablation of a member. So it's like you're losing part of your limb there. And then we've got a poster of Ambrose Paré. It's unclear whether or not this is part of the space in which the patient is sitting. So the Ambrose Paré, I don't know, maybe he's just a poster on the wall that they kind of pop up there in the hospital, but I don't know if they're going to have the definition of amputation up on the hospital wall there. So what happens here is we've got these two intertwined narratives, and the narratives themselves illustrate the trauma and then his recovery, and that is quite consistent with the way that medical information handles trauma and recovery. So for example, Judith Herman, who's written the seminal work on trauma and recovery, says that what you need to do in order to recover from trauma is create a narrative. So Chochois is kind of enacting this here. So let me see here where we're at. Okay. Right, so if we think about what I said before, that he's kind of situated here as a medical object, it's a problematic for me as a reader of this text, because if I'm looking for someone to be enacting, say, the values of narrative medicine or graphic medicine and honoring the patient's experience, we don't necessarily see this. So throughout these kind of colored narratives, he's consistently rendered as the object of medical experimentation. So as you can see, this is an image from what would happen in medieval amputation. So apparently in the medieval period, if you were lost a limb, they just kind of hacked it off with like an axe or a sword or something, and they just stuck it in boiling water, oil, and then hope for the best. And apparently everyone died from this. And I guess it's not surprising given our current medical knowledge. But as you can see, the face on this character who is being amputated and stuck in boiling oil is our same guy. So that's the same face here. And Ambrose Paré kind of walks through how he moved from this horrific series of practices to findings that led us to the modern history of amputation. But then look at what happens to him as we get to the history of modern amputation. So we have him, we can see it's highlighted where he lost his arm, but they basically, he's like a little meat diagram there, and then he's all kind of chopped up, and it's him still. And we can see Ambrose Paré, you might not recognize him with his little face mask, but that's him there in the operating theater. So for me, looking at this, it's just like, that is absolutely fascinating. So if I kind of go back and I think through the rhetorical matrix or the theoretical matrix that I put together for myself, it's like, oh, okay, he's definitely like an object of a medical gaze, like the medical gaze is working out okay, but I'm not seeing how his experience is articulated back into that, and therefore is the book kind of fulfilling the promise of what we're looking for in terms of putting together the two pieces of health humanities. So I'll just walk through a few more images here. This is the opening image. So we have the red section where we hear about the history of amputation, and then there's another little black and white section where, you know, he can't sleep, he can't eat, he's depressed because he has lost his limb. And here we see he's starting to have phantom pain in his limb, and we can see he's going into a deep depression. The next frame, Ambrose Paré kind of pops back in, and he's all ready to start educating him about amputation and other things that Ambrose Paré likes to talk about, because he, of course, is the main audience of his own tales. And he sees how upset that he is, and he's like, oh, let me explain to you about nerves and neurons. And the rest of that segment just goes into neurology. And it's beautifully, beautifully illustrated. But again, for me, it sort of would violate the principles of either graphic medicine or narrative medicine, because Ambrose Paré, like, he sees that he's upset, but he makes no attempt at intervention. So that segment actually ends with this kind of bizarre little interlude, and as we can see, again, this guy's been rendered again into a medical illustration, and it's just kind of a dissection of the brain and the cross-section that's labeled. So fascinating on the one level, but also kind of mildly disturbing on another level, because it's just rendering him into an object. And then again, similarly, this is the prosthesis section. So as he's feeling better in his little black and white segment, it's like, okay, he's ready to get his replacement arm. So we go through the history of the prosthetic limb, and we can see all our soldiers. And again, there he is, he's the model for the prosthetic limb. And even though it's evident that he feels better by the end of this segment, and if I just go back a second, you can see here that he's kind of talking a little. As soon as Ambrose Paré shows up, he maybe asks a question or two, but it's all Ambrose Paré talking. And you can see also here in this in these two panels, all of these speech bubbles, they're all Ambrose Paré kind of talking at this character, not kind of speaking with him, which is fascinating. Now, when we get into the transhumanism section, this for me has sort of multiple layers of difficulty. So transhumanism is kind of like post-humanity in that it's like, oh, okay, people can get better and better, and we can incorporate technology to make us better. Sadly for transhumanism, it was sort of very heavily associated with things like eugenics and fascism. So transhumanism is also about like kind of exterminating people in order to make us better as well, which is unproblematically dumped into this narrative. So it's just like, okay, transhumanism, that's fine. I'm like, maybe it's different in French. Maybe I'm just mistranslating it. No, I couldn't find anything that led me any place different. So Chochois is just kind of constructing this unproblematic narrative of progress. So she's just taking transhumanism as, oh, that's a way of constructing progress, and it's theoretical. But as you can see, there's a linkage here between, oh, you have a prosthetic limb, well, that's kind of like a spacesuit, and that's kind of like whatever this sort of weird hairy robot thing is, and that's kind of like being a fish man. So this is great. It's great that you lost your arm, because now you can really be better than human. And as we see again, all of the little thought bubbles. So we can see here, he's starting to talk a little bit. The end of this section ends with Ambrose Paré asking him his opinion and asking about his experience, and the narrative stops. Very, very fascinating. And then the sort of afterlude is him and his girlfriend, and they go out for a dance, and then they do whatever, and he goes to school, and he's got his prosthetic limb, and everything's fine. So, like, this is just absolutely fascinating. So we've got this interesting theoretical perspective worked in here. We've got this beautiful art. I mean, the art is absolutely, I've only shown you a very, very tiny subsection. The art is amazing. I recommend looking at this even if you don't speak French, just for the art. But there's this unproblematic way that this patient is just kind of treated like an object, and he doesn't even have a name. So it's fairly clear that this is just intended as an educative tool, and it's not really intended to relate a patient experience. I was like, okay, well, do we throw out all work by medical illustrators, or do I keep looking? And I happened to meet at a conference. I was at a health humanities seminar at Drew University in New Jersey, and I met Greta Wilbur. She was one of the plenary speakers, and as I said, she was the inaugural artist in residence at the New York Academy of Medicine. She is fascinating. She does all sorts of things. They do illustrations with needlepoint. She's a massage therapist, I believe, or a physical therapist. She runs these workshops where she shows people how to figure out the musculature in the body by using skeletal models and then drawing the muscles onto people's legs. I mean, it's just fascinating. And she writes these comic books. They're called Pathology Labs. So they're these little mini comic books, and they're intended to be very funny. And the one that she presented on was The Wandering Uterus. So The Wandering Uterus is a semi-autobiographical tale, and this is the opening here. Is she has a headache. This is a self-portrait here, and her friends keep telling her, don't go to Western medicine. You're going to use traditional remedies. And she doesn't believe it. At least that's what she explained when she gave the presentation that I heard. But as you're reading this, you would kind of see. So she's got a headache. She doesn't want to see a doctor. My friends say I should heal myself with ancient wisdom, with a capital A and a capital W. And as you can see, we've got these little bands. We're looking for cherubs. But instead we have the wandering uterus. So can ancient wisdom help her? Well, if she looks at her uterus, and there's a little close-up here, that we have these, this is some of the many poses of the wandering uterus. So this is a theory that arose first in ancient Egypt. So if a woman was ill, they were like, oh, your womb has fallen out of place and it just needs to be resituated. So she has a panel as a woman, she's got her ankle is hurt, and the doctor's like, oh yeah, actually no, your ankle is not hurt, it's your womb has fallen down in there. and it's really not sprained. So you just need to get your womb back where it needs to be, and I can see that you're having the same expression as the Egyptian woman is having. And then the doctor says, oh, I'm going to write a scroll about this. So this is how we know, because they recorded it. Plato believed in the wandering uterus. Plato believed that the womb was not part of a woman, that it was an animal, and that it roamed the body angrily, and it needed to be placated with a fetus. So that's that. And also, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, also believed in the wandering uterus, and he also felt that this was something that really kind of needed to be taken care of. And what you needed to do when your uterus kind of got running around the body is you need to get pregnant, because that's the only thing that will hold the uterus in place. So Wilbur walks through all of her attempts to kind of follow the different remedies. So different eons had different remedies that were designed to entice the uterus back into place. And then, you know, she's like, okay, and then she's like, okay, well, we'll try to get pregnant. So basically what happens when she tries these ancient remedies is her cat is frightened. And at the end of the book, she decides that what she needs to do is go and try acupuncture. But the other thing that's interesting for me about this book isn't just this narrative of the wandering uterus and the way she kind of draws on various historical moments. So it's not just like Plato, and it's not just Hippocrates, and it's not just medieval work. It's, you know, she goes from ancient Egypt to the present, which is fairly fascinating. But it's also the way she situates this against medical illustration. So she's an expert medical illustrator, and the history of medical illustration actually antedates Foucault. So Vesalius in the 1500s is kind of considered to be the father of medical illustration. It was the first series of medical illustrations that were done from actual cadavers, usually. So she used this image in order to make this image. So she's doing a visual simulation of ancient texts. And as we can see here, these are all the places that the uterus can get to. She has another charming little image of the uterus kicking a brain. So if you're in a bad mood or something, that's because your uterus got up in your head and it's kicking your brain. So it's a problem that the uterus has. So let me just quickly pull myself together here for a moment. So, right. So at the end of this book, what Wilbur does is she is now making her acupuncture appointment. There's no explicit critique, like this is ridiculous, this is not what I want to do, my friends are crazy, the wandering uterus is a preposterous notion. She's just like, okay, I'm going to try acupuncture now because clearly the wandering uterus cures aren't working. So she's kind of walking through a more empirical means of assessing this. She's not concentrating very much on her own experience. There's very little reflection here about, oh, my head is really hurting, and this is my experience, and I'm upset with my friends. It's just kind of a systematic walkthrough of all the different things you can try. And then at the very end, she's got this little afterword where she situates her book against another book. It's called Perilous Chastity. And it's a much longer academic text in which the author walks through all of the different permutations of the wandering uterus. So she's kind of borrowed part of the narrative from this other book. And I'm like, that's really super fascinating. However, if I go back and think about the critiques that I had of Chauchois' work, it's like, is it really doing the work that I would want sort of graphic medicine or narrative medicine to do? Well, no, not exactly, but it's definitely closer because it's taking a much more empirical approach to this. So how do I manage this information at the end? And I don't know, I actually have a book chapter coming out on this that I don't think I come to a firm and stunning conclusion, but I guess I could always, we haven't done page proofs yet, so maybe I could work a sentence in at the end. But for me, both of these books are really important. They're a really important illustration of how medical education and humanistic endeavor can be used together to address both audiences, but they're not really fully sufficient for either audience. And I think that they create a space for a different kind of inquiry. So we don't need to just concentrate on the patient experience and graphic narrative. There's other ways to use graphic narrative to inform medicine and medical practice. But also there's different ways to show patient experience. And while I don't necessarily entirely approve of everything that Joshua does with our poor onion sufferer, particularly that image where he gets all chopped up into bits, like that to me is a little bit disturbing. It's still quite fascinating because she does bring the guy on a voyage of discovery, and he does get better by the end. So it's like how we come to terms with this, I think, is like maybe a next step in thinking about what we can do to bridge these domains. So like that's basically what I have.